The morning after the tragedy found Miss Marple engaged in what appeared to be a perfectly innocent task, helping Mrs. Bantry retrieve a misplaced knitting needle that had supposedly rolled beneath the judge's table during yesterday's chaos. Inspector Slack, confident in his imminent arrest of Mrs. Fleming, paid little attention to the elderly lady's gentle fussing among the remnants of the fate. As Miss Marple carefully examined the ground beneath the table, her keen eyes noted details that others had dismissed as inconsequential. A few scattered crumbs from the fatal pie, a smudge of cinnamon on the white tablecloth, and there, caught in the wicker refuse basket beside the judging station, a length of blue grosgrain ribbon, carelessly discarded among the other detritus of the village celebration. She lifted it delicately, her fingers immediately recognizing the quality and weight. This was not the pale, forget-me-not blue of Mrs. Fleming's hatband that she had admired at church, but rather the deeper, more institutional shade used for the Fates Prize rosettes. More telling still was the way it had been tied, and then hastily cut free. The creases in the fabric told a story that only the most observant eye would notice. Miss Marple examined the knot marks with the attention of someone who had spent decades watching human hands at work. This ribbon had been secured with a reef knot left over right, then right over left, pulled tight with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making things stay fastened. Not the decorative bow that any village lady would instinctively create when tying a muslin cover over her prize entry, but the practical, no-nonsense knot of a person trained in securing things properly. The implications were quite fascinating. Mrs. Fleming's pie had indeed been covered with blue ribbon when it arrived at the judging table, but Miss Marple now recalled with perfect clarity that the widow had tied her muslin cloth with a charming bow that matched her careful, feminine presentation. Yet this discarded ribbon bore the unmistakable marks of masculine efficiency, the kind of knot a military man might tie, or perhaps someone with experience in practical matters where appearance mattered less than function. "Find what you were looking for, Miss Marple?" Constable Barnes inquired politely, though his attention was clearly focused on more important matters. "Oh yes, dear," she replied mildly, slipping the ribbon into her knitting bag, with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to noticing what others missed. "Just tidying up a bit. Such a shame about the mess." As she walked slowly home, Miss Marple reflected on the other small inconsistencies that had been troubling her about Mrs. Fleming. The elegant silver pie server with its elaborate E monogram had seemed oddly formal for a woman who claimed to prefer practical approaches to domestic tasks. When questioned about it, Mrs. Fleming had explained it as a remnant from her maiden name, yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered the widow introducing herself at church as Constance Fleming, formerly Miss Davies. A small slip, perhaps, but combined with the ribbon evidence, it suggested layers of deception that ran deeper than anyone had yet realized. The widow was certainly hiding something, but Miss Marple was increasingly convinced it was not murder. The genuine shock and horror on Mrs. Fleming's face when Colonel Melchett collapsed had been unmistakable to someone experienced in reading human nature. Whatever secrets the woman harbored, they did not include the knowledge that her pie contained poison, which meant that someone else had tampered with Mrs. Fleming's entry after it arrived at the fete. Someone who had access to the judging table, who could work quickly and efficiently, and who was clever enough to retie the muslin cover in a way that would pass casual inspection. The discarded ribbon suggested haste, a quick substitution that left evidence only the most careful observer would notice. Inspector Slack's certainty about Mrs. Fleming's guilt was understandable but premature. The obvious suspect was indeed hiding something, but she was also being used as camouflage by someone far more cunning. The real murderer had counted on the village's eagerness to blame the mysterious newcomer, never imagining that their practical efficiency in retying a ribbon would leave traces of their presence. As Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, she reflected on the curious psychology of the crime. The killer had been both clever and careless, clever enough to use Mrs. Fleming as a shield, but careless enough to leave evidence of their masculine approach to what should have been a feminine task. The truth, she suspected, would prove far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward solution suggested. The widow who brought a poisoned pie, Miss Marple mystery. The bunting fluttered cheerfully above the street Mary Mead village green, where the annual summer fete had drawn its usual collection of worthies and gossips. Trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade preserves, embroidered tea cozies, and an impressive display of baked goods that would determine the year's reigning domestic champion. The brass band from Little Wickham wheezed through a spirited rendition of Jerusalem, while children darted between the stalls with sticky fingers and shining faces. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the shade of the ancient oak, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on what appeared to be a christening shawl. Her blue eyes, however, were far more occupied with observing the gentle drama unfolding around the baking competition table than with the delicate lace pattern emerging from her wool, remarked Mrs. Bantry, settling beside her with a satisfied sigh. Though I must say that new Mrs. Fleming has caused quite a stir with her entry. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the judging table, where a magnificent apple pie sat among the other offerings. Its crust was perfectly golden, latticed with mathematical precision, and it seemed to draw admiring glances from even the most competitive village bakers. Beside it stood Mrs. Constance Fleming, a handsome woman of perhaps 50, dressed in appropriate black mourning attire. She had arrived in Street Mary Mead only 3 months prior, taking residence at Ivy Cottage after the sudden death of her husband in London. Poor dear, Mrs. Bantry continued in lowered tones. Though between you and me, Jane, there's something rather— Not that one should judge, of course. Miss Marple made a gentle murmur of agreement, though she had noticed the same thing herself. Mrs. Fleming possessed the sort of self-contained dignity that spoke of either genuine strength or careful performance. Her interactions with the villagers were perfectly cordial, yet maintained a certain distance, as if she were playing a role she had studied but not quite mastered. "The judging begins," announced the vicar, tapping a spoon against his teacup. The 3 judges, Reverend Clement, Lady Ashworth, and Colonel Melkett, approached their task with the gravity it deserved in a village where such competitions were taken seriously indeed. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Fleming stepped forward to present her pie, noting the woman's graceful movements and the way her dark eyes seemed to catalogue every face in the small crowd. There was something almost calculating in that gaze, though it might simply have been the natural wariness of a newcomer still finding her place. "Remarkable crust work," pronounced Lady Ashworth, examining the pie with the expertise of a woman who had judged such competitions for 30 years. "And the aroma is quite exceptional." Colonel Melchett, a man whose military bearing extended to his approach to pastry evaluation, nodded approvingly. "Indeed, Mrs. Fleming, you've done us proud. This appears to be the clear winner." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the gathered villagers, though Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Gascoigne's pursed lips and the way young Mrs. Price's hands clenched slightly at her sides. Competition, she reflected, brought out such interesting aspects of human nature. Perhaps the judges would care for a taste, suggested Mrs. Fleming, her voice carrying just the right note of modest pride. She produced a silver pie server. Miss Marple noticed it was monogrammed with an elaborate E rather than the expected F, and cut 3 generous portions. Colonel Melchett, never one to refuse a good pudding, accepted his slice with enthusiasm. "Delightful presentation, my dear lady. Quite delightful indeed." He took a substantial bite, chewing thoughtfully. "The fruit is perfectly balanced, and the spicing is—" His words died abruptly. The colonel's face, moments before flushed with pleasure, began to contort in a most alarming manner. His hand flew to his throat, and he made a strangled, gasping sound that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Colonel!" Lady Ashworth exclaimed, rising from her chair as the military man doubled over, clutching his stomach. The slice of pie tumbled from his grasp, scattering crumbs across the grass. Miss Marple set down her knitting and observed with sharp attention as chaos erupted around the judging table. Mrs. Fleming stood frozen, her face a mask of horror and confusion, while the vicar called for Dr. Haydock and several villagers rushed to assist the stricken colonel, but it was too late. Within moments, Colonel Melchett lay still upon the village green, his final breath carrying the sweet scent of apples and something else entirely, something that Miss Marple's experienced nose recognized with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone. The summer fete had become something altogether more sinister, and the widow's perfect pie would never be forgotten in Street Mary Mead. The cheerful strains of Jerusalem died away abruptly as Dr. Haydock knelt beside Colonel Melchett's still form, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. The village green, moments before alive with laughter and conversation, now held the hushed tension of a church during prayers for the dying. Children were quietly shepherded away by their mothers, though several small faces peered around adult skirts with the morbid fascination that tragedy always inspired in the young. "I'm afraid there's no doubt," Dr. Haydock announced quietly, rising from his examination. His voice carried clearly in the unnatural silence. "Poisoning, and a swift-acting variety at that. The symptoms were unmistakable, the convulsions, the respiratory distress." His gaze moved meaningfully toward the abandoned slice of pie scattered across the grass. "We must treat this as a crime scene now." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered villagers. Lady Ashworth swayed slightly and was guided to a chair, while Reverend Clement stood in stricken uncertainty, his half-raised fork still poised over his untouched portion of Mrs. Fleming's prize-winning creation. Miss Marple remained quietly seated beneath the ancient oak, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, though her blue eyes never ceased their careful observation. She noted how Mrs. Fleming stood rigid beside the judging table, her black-gloved hands clasped so tightly that the fine stitching creaked with the strain. The widow's face maintained its composed mask, but there was something in the brittle set of her mouth that spoke of barely controlled emotion. Whether grief, fear, or something else entirely remained to be determined. Within the hour, Inspector Slack arrived with his customary air of grim efficiency, 2 constables trailing in his wake. His sharp eyes took in the scene with professional assessment. The deceased colonel, the fatal pie, and the cluster of whispering villagers who had already begun the inevitable process of theory and speculation. "Right then," Inspector Slack declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "No one leaves until we've had statements from everyone. Constable Barnes, start with the witnesses." His attention fixed immediately upon Mrs. Fleming with the directness of a man who preferred obvious solutions. "This is your pie, madam?" "Yes," Mrs. Fleming replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I prepared it this morning at Ivy Cottage for the competition. The ingredients were quite ordinary apples from Mr. Pritchard's shop, flour and sugar from the cooperative." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. Young Tom Pritchard, the grocer's son, stood near the refreshment tent, and she had distinctly heard him mention to his companion that Mrs. Fleming hadn't purchased apples the previous day, as she claimed, but had come in Tuesday for flour and sugar only. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned that small discrepancies often proved most illuminating. As Inspector Slack continued his preliminary questioning, the village gossip mill began its inevitable work. Gascoigne, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic pronouncement, declared to anyone within hearing, "I always said there was something peculiar about that woman. Moving here so soon after her husband's death, setting up house as if nothing had happened. Mark my words, this is no accident." Bantry, though her voice lacked conviction. She wouldn't poison her own pie and serve it to the judges. What possible motive could she have? "Perhaps," suggested Mr. Pye, the village's resident eccentric, adjusting his spectacles with theatrical precision. "The colonel wasn't the intended victim at all. Perhaps someone else was meant to taste that particular slice." This suggestion sent fresh ripples of speculation through the crowd. Miss Marple observed how quickly suspicion crystallized around the obvious suspect, the newcomer, the widow with her carefully maintained composure and her elegant silver pie server bearing an ornate monogram that, she now noticed, displayed an elaborate E rather than the expected F for Fleming. Young Mrs. Price, whose own lemon drizzle cake now seemed pitifully irrelevant, whispered urgently to her neighbor, "Did you see how quickly she had her explanation ready? About the ingredients, I mean, as if she'd rehearsed it." Through it all, Mrs. Fleming maintained her dignified stance beside the fatal creation, neither approaching nor retreating from the scene. Once, Miss Marple observed, the widow's hand drifted toward the monogrammed server, then withdrew, with the smallest recoil, a movement so subtle that only the most careful observer would have noticed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, the bunting still fluttered with inappropriate cheerfulness overhead. The summer fete had transformed into something far more sinister, and Miss Marple settled more comfortably in her chair, prepared to watch the human drama unfold. Experience had taught her that the obvious answer was rarely the correct one, and the truth, when it finally emerged, would likely prove far more complex than the village's eager theories suggested. The real mystery, she suspected, was only just beginning. The village hall had been hastily transformed into Inspector Slack's makeshift headquarters, its cheerful bunting providing an oddly festive backdrop to the grim business at hand. Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea urn, ostensibly helping Mrs. Bantry serve refreshments to the shaken villagers, but in reality maintaining an excellent vantage point from which to observe the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attention. Inspector Slack, she noted with mild disapproval, was pursuing his investigation with predictable directness, already dismissing the Reverend's tentative suggestion that the poisoning might have been accidental. Fleming, with the determination of a man who preferred obvious solutions to complex puzzles. The inspector said, consulting his notebook with obvious satisfaction, "You prepared this pie entirely by yourself, you say?" "Yes, Inspector. I've always prided myself on my baking." Fleming's voice remained steady, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her black-gloved hands. "My late husband was particularly fond of my apple pie." Haydock entered at that moment, his weathered face bearing the grave expression that accompanied unpleasant duties. "Inspector, I've completed my preliminary examination. The symptoms are consistent with cyanide poisoning bitter almonds, though not everyone can detect the scent, swift-acting and quite lethal in the quantity consumed." A collective shudder ran through the assembled villagers. Mrs. Gascoigne clutched her handkerchief more tightly, while young Mrs. Price instinctively moved closer to her husband. "Cyanide," Inspector Slack repeated with grim satisfaction. "Not something one finds lying about in the average kitchen. Where might one obtain such a substance, Doctor? Photography developing solutions contain it, as do certain industrial processes. Some pesticides as well, though those are becoming less common." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. She recalled Mrs. Fleming mentioning during their brief introduction at church that her late husband had been a photographer with his own dark room, a connection that would not escape Inspector Slack's attention for long. Mrs. Fleming, the inspector continued, what was your husband's profession? He was a photographer, commercial work, primarily. The answer came after the smallest hesitation, and Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Fleming's gaze flickered momentarily toward the door, as if calculating distances. He maintained a dark room in our London home. The implication settled heavily in the room. Inspector Slack made a note with obvious satisfaction, clearly believing he had established both means and opportunity. Young Tom Pritchard, who had been hovering nervously near the refreshment table, suddenly spoke up. Begging your pardon, Inspector, but about those apples, Mrs. Fleming said she bought them from our shop, but I don't recall selling her any apples recently, just flour and sugar on Tuesday. That was all. For the first time, Mrs. Fleming's composure wavered slightly. Perhaps I was mistaken about the day. I may have had some apples already at the cottage. My memory has been somewhat unreliable since my bereavement. Miss Marple set down her teacup with the gentlest of sounds. The explanation was perfectly reasonable, yet something about the widow's manner suggested layers beneath the surface. She remembered observing from her bedroom window lights burning at Ivy Cottage much earlier than 7 o'clock, closer to 5 if her memory served. Another small discrepancy that might prove illuminating. As the questioning continued, the village gossip mill began its inevitable work. Mrs. Gascoigne declared to anyone within hearing, I always said there was something peculiar about that woman. And her husband died quite suddenly in London, you know. A heart attack, they said, but who's to say? Fleming maintained her dignified composure, answering each question with neither excessive detail nor suspicious brevity. Miss Marple found herself troubled by something she couldn't quite articulate. If the widow were guilty of murder, she was either remarkably cold-blooded or possessed of exceptional self-control. But it was the small details that captured Miss Marple's attention. The monogrammed pie server with its elaborate E rather than F, the blue grosgrain ribbon that had tied the muslin cover, with a gardener's practical knot rather than a woman's decorative bow, and most tellingly, Mrs. Fleming's instinctive recoil from her own serving utensil during the chaos. As Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary interviews, clearly satisfied with his obvious suspect, Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. The village, in its rush to condemn, was missing the very essence of the crime. Like a pattern in embroidery, she mused, sometimes the simplest designs were created to hide the most intricate stitches beneath. The real investigation, she suspected, was only just beginning. By the following morning, Inspector Slack had reached his conclusions with the decisive satisfaction of a man who preferred straightforward solutions to complex puzzles. The village hall, still bearing traces of yesterday's festivities, had been transformed into his temporary headquarters, where he addressed Constable Barnes with unmistakable confidence. The case is quite clear, Barnes, he declared, consulting his notebook with evident pleasure. Mrs. Fleming prepared the pie, had access to cyanide through her late husband's photographic chemicals, and served the fatal slice directly to the victim. Means, motive, and opportunity all present and accounted for. The village had reached similar conclusions with the swift certainty that characterized small communities faced with shocking events. Mrs. Gascoigne held court at the post office, her voice carrying the authority of confirmed suspicion. I always said there was something peculiar about that woman. Too composed by half, and arriving here so soon after her husband's convenient death in London. Mark my words, she's done this before. Even Mrs. Bantry, usually more charitable in her judgments, found herself swayed by the mounting evidence. It does seem to fit together rather neatly, she admitted to Miss Marple over their morning tea. The photographic chemicals, her odd behavior about the apples, and that business with young Tom Pritchard catching her in an inconsistency. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. Yet something in her mild blue eyes suggested reservations that she kept carefully to herself. The obvious solution, in her considerable experience, was rarely the correct one, particularly when it satisfied everyone quite so completely. Inspector Slack's confidence only increased as he prepared to make his arrest. "We'll search Ivy Cottage this afternoon," he announced to his constables. "Look for photographic chemicals, any remaining cyanide compounds, and that silver pie server will need to trace its provenance properly." This last detail had been troubling Miss Marple considerably. During her seemingly casual stroll past Ivy Cottage the previous evening, she had encountered Mrs. Fleming, tending her small garden with movements that spoke of barely controlled agitation. Their brief conversation had been most illuminating. "Beautiful pie server you used yesterday," Miss Marple had observed gently. "The monogramming is quite elegant. That ornate E is so distinctive." Mrs. Fleming's composure had wavered slightly. "It was my maiden name, Evelyn Ellis. I kept some pieces from before my marriage." The explanation had come too quickly, and her eyes hadn't quite met Miss Marple's. More telling still had been Mrs. Fleming's reaction when Miss Marple mentioned the practical knot used to tie the muslin cover. "My dear departed husband always tied his garden twine exactly that way," she had remarked innocently. "Quite different from the bows we ladies usually prefer." The widow's hands had tightened visibly on her gardening shears. "I've always been practical about such things. Living alone teaches one efficiency." As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on these small inconsistencies. If Mrs. Fleming were indeed guilty of murder, she was either remarkably foolish to poison her own clearly identifiable entry, or remarkably clever in choosing such an obvious method to deflect suspicion. But there was a third possibility that the village, in its rush to judgment, was overlooking entirely. The woman's genuine surprise at Colonel Melchett's collapse had been unmistakable to Miss Marple's experienced eye. Mrs. Fleming had expected her pie to be perfectly harmless of that. Miss Marple was increasingly certain. Yet the widow was clearly hiding something, playing a role she had studied but not quite mastered. Dr. Haydock's confirmation that cyanide had been the cause of death only strengthened Inspector Slack's position. "Swift-acting and quite lethal," he had pronounced, "consistent with photographic developing solutions." But Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very efficiency of the crime. The poison had acted too quickly, too dramatically for a woman seeking to avoid detection. It suggested either desperation or deliberate theatricality, neither of which seemed consistent with Mrs. Fleming's careful, controlled personality. As Inspector Slack prepared to close his case, Miss Marple settled more comfortably in her chair by the window, prepared to watch the human drama unfold. The truth, she suspected, lay hidden beneath layers of deception that ran far deeper than the village imagined. Fleming was neither murderer nor innocent victim, but something more complex, altogether a woman caught in circumstances she neither created nor fully understood. The real investigation, Miss Marple mused, was only just beginning. The morning after the tragedy found Miss Marple engaged in what appeared to be a perfectly innocent task, helping Mrs. Bantry retrieve a misplaced knitting needle that had supposedly rolled beneath the judge's table during yesterday's chaos. Inspector Slack, confident in his imminent arrest of Mrs. Fleming, paid little attention to the elderly lady's gentle fussing among the remnants of the fete. As Miss Marple carefully examined the ground beneath the table, her keen eyes noted details that others had dismissed as inconsequential. A few scattered crumbs from the fatal pie, a smudge of cinnamon on the white tablecloth, and there caught in the wicker refuse basket beside the judging station, a length of blue grosgrain ribbon, carelessly discarded among the other detritus of the village celebration. She lifted it delicately, her fingers immediately recognizing the quality and weight. This was not the pale forget-me-not blue of Mrs. Fleming's hatband that she had admired at church, but rather the deeper, more institutional shade used for the fête's prize rosettes. More telling still was the way it had been tied and then hastily cut free. The creases in the fabric told a story that only the most observant eye would notice. Miss Marple examined the knot marks with the attention of someone who had spent decades watching human hands at work. This ribbon had been secured with a reef, not left over right, then right over left, pulled tight, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making things stay fastened. Not the decorative bow that any village lady would instinctively create when tying a muslin cover over her prize entry, but the practical, no-nonsense knot of a person trained in securing things properly. The implications were quite fascinating. Mrs. Fleming's pie had indeed been covered with blue ribbon when it arrived at the judging table, but Miss Marple now recalled with perfect clarity that the widow had tied her muslin cloth with a charming bow that matched her careful, feminine presentation. Yet this discarded ribbon bore the unmistakable marks of masculine efficiency, the kind of knot a military man might tie, or perhaps someone with experience in practical matters where appearance mattered less than function. "Find what you were looking for, Miss Marple?" Constable Barnes inquired politely, though his attention was clearly focused on more important matters. "Oh yes, dear," she replied mildly, slipping the ribbon into her knitting bag with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to noticing what others missed. "Just tidying up a bit. Such a shame about the mess." As she walked slowly home, Miss Marple reflected on the other small inconsistencies that had been troubling her about Mrs. Fleming. The elegant silver pie server with its elaborate E monogram had seemed oddly formal for a woman who claimed to prefer practical approaches to domestic tasks. When questioned about it, Mrs. Fleming had explained it as a remnant from her maiden name, yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered the widow introducing herself at church as Constance Fleming, formerly Miss Davies. A small slip, perhaps, but combined with the ribbon evidence, it suggested layers of deception that ran deeper than anyone had yet realized. The widow was certainly hiding something, but Miss Marple was increasingly convinced it was not murder. The genuine shock and horror on Mrs. Fleming's face when Colonel Melchett collapsed had been unmistakable to someone experienced in reading human nature. Whatever secrets the woman harbored, they did not include the knowledge that her pie contained poison, which meant that someone else had tampered with Mrs. Fleming's entry after it arrived at the fete. Someone who had access to the judging table, who could work quickly and efficiently, and who was clever enough to retie the muslin cover in a way that would pass casual inspection. The discarded ribbon suggested haste, a quick substitution that left evidence only the most careful observer would notice. Inspector Slack's certainty about Mrs. Fleming's guilt was understandable but premature. The obvious suspect was indeed hiding something, but she was also being used as camouflage by someone far more cunning. The real murderer had counted on the village's eagerness to blame the mysterious newcomer, never imagining that their practical efficiency in retying a ribbon would leave traces of their presence. As Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, she reflected on the curious psychology of the crime. The killer had been both clever and careless, clever enough to use Mrs. Fleming as a shield, but careless enough to leave evidence of their masculine approach to what should have been a feminine task. The truth, she suspected, would prove far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward solution suggested. Inspector Slack emerged from Ivy Cottage with the satisfied stride of a man whose theories had been thoroughly vindicated. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position by the garden gate, detected subtle signs of perplexity beneath his confident exterior. The search had indeed yielded photographic chemicals in the backroom bottles of developer and fixer solutions containing sufficient cyanide compounds to account for the poisoning, but something in the inspector's manner suggested the discovery had raised as many questions as it answered. Mrs. Fleming stood in her doorway with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal, though Miss Marple noted a new brittleness in her bearing, like fine china under pressure. The widow's black-gloved hands remained perfectly still, but her eyes held the watchful tension of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture. The first crack appeared courtesy of Mrs. Gascoigne, who arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning with information that transformed the entire complexion of the case. "You'll never guess what I've discovered," she announced breathlessly, settling herself with obvious relish. "That woman isn't Mrs. Fleming at all. My cousin in London made inquiries. The real Mrs. Constance Fleming died in a motor accident 3 months ago, along with her husband." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused almost imperceptibly. "How very interesting. And our Mrs. Fleming is actually Miss Evelyn Ellis, the Flemings' housekeeper. She'd worked for them 15 years, apparently, and was quite devoted to Mr. Fleming, perhaps too devoted, if you understand my meaning." The revelation spread through Street Mary Mead with predictable velocity, yet it seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Why would a devoted housekeeper assume her deceased employer's identity? The monogrammed pie server with its elaborate E, the widow's hesitation about her late husband's profession, the early lights at Ivy Cottage all suddenly made sense, yet painted a picture of deception rather than murder. Dr. Haydock provided another crucial piece when he called upon Miss Marple that afternoon. "The photographic chemicals are certainly there," he admitted quietly, "but they're old, Jane. Months old, and barely touched. If someone had been extracting cyanide recently, there would be evidence residue, fresh chemical odors, proper equipment. I found none of that. Meanwhile, the village's social fabric began revealing its hidden tensions. With the obvious suspect removed, tongues loosened and old resentments surfaced. At the post office, Miss Marple learned that Colonel Melchett had been far from universally beloved. His military efficiency had extended to village affairs, where he'd made enemies through officious interference and broken promises. "Always playing God with other people's livelihoods," muttered Arthur Price, whose plumbing business had suffered after the colonel withdrew promised support. Said he'd put in a good word with the council, then changed his mind over some petty disagreement. Young Tom Pritchard, emboldened by his role as key witness, offered another perspective. "My father says military men know about poisons from the war which ones work fast, which are hard to detect. Colonel Melchett was in the engineers, wasn't he?" The observation struck Miss Marple as particularly astute. If someone wanted to implicate the photographic chemicals while actually obtaining poison elsewhere, they would need considerable knowledge of such matters. Military training would certainly provide that expertise. The blue ribbon with its practical reef knot took on new significance in this context. Miss Marple recalled her conversation with Hemmings, the groundsman, whose hands bore telltale traces of blue dye and whose jacket pocket contained a strip of matching grosgrain. His defensive reaction when she'd mentioned the knot-tying had been most illuminating. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the curious psychology emerging from the case. Someone had been both patient and opportunistic, waiting for the perfect moment when suspicion would naturally fall on the mysterious newcomer. They had counted on the village's eagerness to blame Evelyn Ellis, never imagining that their own habits of military efficiency would leave traces for those who knew how to read them. The truth was far more complex than Inspector Slack's straightforward solution suggested. Evelyn Ellis was indeed hiding something, but it was fear rather than guilt that drove her deception. Someone else had used her masquerade as camouflage for murder, someone who understood both chemistry and human nature well enough to arrange a killing that would implicate the obvious suspect while concealing their own deadly efficiency. The morning brought revelations that transformed the entire complexion of the case, though not in the manner Inspector Slack had anticipated. Dr. Haydock arrived at the village hall with his weathered face, bearing the grave expression that accompanied his most disturbing discoveries, his usual professional composure visibly shaken by what his more thorough examination had revealed. "Inspector, I'm afraid we've been operating under a fundamental misapprehension," he began, settling his medical bag with deliberate care. "The cyanide compound I've isolated is far more sophisticated than anything one might extract from photographic chemicals. This is laboratory-grade material, requiring considerable expertise to prepare and dose correctly." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the tea urn with her characteristic discretion, noted how this revelation affected the assembled villagers. Inspector Slack's confidence visibly deflated, while several others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Someone with genuine chemical knowledge, not a grieving housekeeper attempting deception, had orchestrated Colonel Melchett's death. The implications became more troubling when Evelyn Ellis herself appeared at the hall, no longer maintaining her masquerade as Mrs. Fleming. The woman looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without her assumed identity, yet there was a dignity in her bearing that spoke of someone finally prepared to tell the truth. "I had nowhere else to go," she confessed quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Mr. and Mrs. Fleming were killed in that motor accident, and I discovered she'd left me the cottage in her will. I was terrified that if anyone knew I was merely their housekeeper, they'd find some way to take it away. I just wanted a home, and to honor their memory." Her explanation was both touching and believable, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by something she couldn't quite articulate. The woman's genuine distress was unmistakable, but there remained layers beneath the surface, not guilt, precisely, but a watchful wariness that suggested she knew more than she was revealing. The mystery deepened when young Tom Pritchard burst into the hall with news that sent fresh shock waves through the community. "There's been a fire at Ivy Cottage. The garden shed's half burned down, but Miss Ellis is safe." Inspector Slack's face darkened with grim understanding. "Arson," he declared after examining the scene. The shed, where Evelyn had kept her gardening tools and several boxes of the Fleming's effects, showed clear signs of deliberate ignition. Someone had attempted to destroy evidence, or perhaps send a threatening message to the woman who had become an inconvenient witness. Miss Marple observed the gathered villagers with her characteristic quiet attention, noting their various reactions to this latest development. Arthur Price seemed unusually agitated, his eyes darting toward the damaged shed with strange intensity. Hemmings, the groundsman, offered assistance with an eagerness that struck her as slightly forced, his hands still bearing traces of blue dye despite obvious attempts at scrubbing. Most tellingly, she noticed how the fire had been set with methodical efficiency, not the random destruction of an emotional outburst, but the calculated work of someone seeking to eliminate specific threats. The killer was growing desperate, yet remained coldly practical in their approach. Dr. Haydock provided another crucial insight as they examined the scene. The timing suggests someone with intimate knowledge of village routines, when Evelyn would be at evening service, when the lanes would be empty. This isn't random violence, but carefully planned intimidation. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered near the damaged shed, her keen eyes noting details that others had missed. Among the charred debris, she glimpsed the remains of what appeared to be correspondence letters bearing London postmarks that had been deliberately targeted by the flames. Someone had wanted to ensure that certain connections remained hidden. The blue ribbon, with its practical reef knot, took on new significance in this context. The arsonist had worked with the same efficient methodology, securing the accelerant-soaked materials with knots that spoke of military training. Yet this clue now seemed almost deliberately misleading, as if the real killer understood exactly what conclusion such evidence would suggest. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her parlor, Reviewing the day's events, she reflected on the curious psychology emerging from the case. Someone was orchestrating an elaborate deception, using both Evelyn Ellis's masquerade and the village's eagerness for simple solutions as camouflage for far more complex motives. The truth was becoming clearer, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. Soon, she suspected, the killer's true face would emerge from the shadows of deception they had so carefully constructed. Miss Marple had always found that the most revealing conversations occurred in the most ordinary circumstances, and so she arranged her little gathering with the casual precision of someone who understood that truth emerged most readily when people believed themselves unobserved. Her sitting room, fragrant with the scent of Earl Grey and Mrs. Bantry's excellent seed cake, provided the perfect stage for what she privately considered her final examination. The invitation had been irresistible in its modesty, a simple tea, to thank those who had shown such kindness to poor Miss Ellis after the fire. Evelyn Ellis herself sat quietly by the window, her composure intact, but her eyes holding the watchful quality of someone still navigating dangerous waters. Young Tom Pritchard hovered near the sideboard with the eager uncertainty of youth, while Dr. Haydock had excused himself on a late call, leaving Miss Marple with precisely the audience she required. Arthur Price arrived precisely on time, his weathered hands bearing fresh scratches that spoke of recent contact with rough materials. Miss Marple noted how his gaze immediately catalogued the room's occupants and exits the instinctive assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating situations for potential complications. "How good of you all to come," Miss Marple murmured, bustling about with the tea things. "Such a comfort to gather after recent unpleasantness. Though I must confess, I've been quite puzzled by certain details that simply won't leave my bread mind." She moved with apparent aimlessness to the sideboard, where she had arranged several items with careful deliberation. The blue grosgrain ribbon with its telltale knot marks, the elegant silver pie server with its elaborate monogram, and a length of muslin cloth. Her fingers traced the ribbon's creases with gentle curiosity. "I found this near the judging table," she explained conversationally. "Such an interesting knot, not a lady's bow, certainly, but tied with considerable expertise. Left over right, then right over left, if I'm not mistaken. My dear nephew Raymond learned such techniques in the Scouts, though I understand military men use them as well." Arthur Price's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer. "Can't say I'd noticed the difference myself," he replied, but his voice had acquired a careful quality that hadn't been present moments before. Miss Marple smiled with gentle understanding. "Oh, but surely someone in your profession would recognize proper knot work? After all, securing pipes and fittings requires such precision. One couldn't afford to have connections come loose at inconvenient moments." As she spoke, she lifted the silver pie server, examining its monogrammed surface with apparent fascination. "Such beautiful craftsmanship. The E is so elegantly rendered rather formal for everyday use, wouldn't you say? One might almost think it belonged in a more professional setting." She passed the server to Tom, who admired the monogram with boyish interest, then to Evelyn, who handled it with the careful reverence of someone touching a treasured memory. When it reached Arthur Price, Miss Marple observed with sharp attention how his calloused fingers automatically found the proper grip, not by the decorative handle as the others had done, but by the blade itself, with the unconscious familiarity of someone accustomed to handling precision instruments. "You have such capable hands, Mr. Price," she observed mildly. "I imagine your work requires considerable knowledge of various compounds, cleaning solvents, pipe treatments, chemical processes, rather like Colonel Melchett's engineering background, in a way." The mention of the Colonel's name produced a subtle but unmistakable reaction. Price's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his fingers drummed once against his knee, a nervous gesture that spoke of barely controlled emotion. Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation, her voice maintaining its conversational tone while her eyes missed nothing. The colonel was quite knowledgeable about such matters, wasn't he? I recall him explaining to Reverend Clement about proper chemical handling at the Fate Committee meeting. He seemed particularly well informed about which substances could be dangerous if improperly mixed. Did he now? Price's response carried an edge that hadn't been there before. Oh yes, he was most thorough in his explanations. Of course, someone with your professional experience would understand such matters equally well. All those specialized compounds you must work with, some of them quite potent, I imagine. The psychological pressure was mounting with gentle inexorability. Miss Marple reached for the ribbon again, her fingers working at the knot with apparent difficulty. I am so clumsy with these things. Perhaps you might show me the proper technique, Mr. Price. I noticed you secured the tent guy ropes at the fete with exactly the same method. Price's face went utterly still. Miss Marple had made no such observation about tent ropes. Indeed, he had worked nowhere near the main marquee, but his failure to correct her assumption revealed everything she needed to know. Only someone intimately familiar with that particular ribbon would fail to challenge such a specific falsehood. I think, she continued with devastating gentleness, that someone with access to professional-grade chemicals might find it quite straightforward to introduce them into a pie filling, particularly if they understood the precise timing required for maximum effect. The question, of course, is why someone would harbor such resentment against poor Colonel Melchett. The dam of Price's composure finally cracked. His hands clenched around his teacup with white-knuckled intensity, and when he spoke, his voice carried the bitter edge of long-suppressed grievance. 20 years I served this village, he said, his words coming in a rush of pent-up fury. 20 years of honest work, fair prices, reliable service. Then that sanctimonious old fool decides to play God with other people's livelihoods. Promised me the council contract, then withdrew his recommendation over some petty disagreement about billing procedures. Destroyed my reputation with a few well-placed words in the right ears. Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding, her blue eyes reflecting not judgment, but profound sadness at the waste of it all. And when you saw the opportunity to implicate poor Miss Ellis with her photographic chemicals and mysterious background, it must have seemed like perfect justice. The final piece of her psychological puzzle had fallen into place with devastating clarity. Arthur Price had possessed all the necessary elements, the technical knowledge to obtain laboratory-grade cyanide, the practical skills to retie the muslin cover without detection, and the burning resentment that had transformed a respected tradesman into a calculating murderer. In the profound silence that followed, Miss Marple reflected on the curious ways that human nature revealed itself under pressure. The truth, as always, had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with sufficient patience and understanding to coax it into the light. Inspector Craddock arrived at the vicarage drawing-room to find a scene that spoke volumes before a word was uttered. Eleanor Ashford sat rigidly in her chair, tears having given way to the hollow composure of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. Miss Marple occupied her usual position by the window, knitting needles still, her gentle eyes holding both sorrow and certainty. Reverend Michael Ashford stood behind his sister, his face bearing the particular devastation of a man discovering that love had taken a murderous form. Doctor Fleming waited near the mantelpiece, while Timothy Marsh, newly released and still bewildered, sat quietly by the door, finally understanding how completely he had been used. Inspector, Miss Marple began in her characteristically gentle manner. I believe Eleanor has something she wishes to tell you, though perhaps it would help if I explained how the pieces came together. She adjusted her spectacles with deliberate care. You see, from the very beginning, The case against poor Timothy felt rather too convenient. Digitalis poisoning requires not merely access to foxgloves, but precise knowledge of extraction and dosage. It is not a crime of passion, but of careful calculation. Miss Marple produced the small scrap of card from her knitting bag. My first real certainty came from this fragment, UW, written in block capitals with those distinctive flourished downstrokes. The same hand that created all the garden party notices also wrote the threatening message found near the tombola stall. Eleanor, despite her claims of botanical ignorance, possessed extensive plant knowledge, as evidenced by the well-annotated reference books in her sitting room. Eleanor's voice emerged as barely a whisper. He was going to destroy Michael. Thorpe had discovered the scandal from his previous parish. A young parishioner who became obsessed, made accusations. Nothing improper happened, but Thorpe was going to use it to ruin Michael's career entirely. The method was ingenious in its simplicity, Miss Marple continued. Eleanor prepared a concentrated digitalis extract in the garden shed, then administered it to Mr. Thorpe during the garden party, most likely in a drink, given her position and access. The poison's delayed action allowed her to establish her presence elsewhere before the symptoms manifested. And the disposal of evidence? Quite clever, really. Eleanor cut fresh roses from the vicarage garden the morning after the murder, using them for church arrangements. This explained both Mrs. Pemberton's surprise at finding specimens already taken and the faint medicinal scent I detected on those particular blooms. Thorpe Fell was actually a clean-cut evidence hastily disposed of at the scene. Dr. Fleming nodded grimly. The timing fits perfectly. Digitalis can take 30 minutes or more to produce cardiac symptoms, allowing the poisoner to be elsewhere when death occurred. Hartwell's misfortune, Miss Marple observed sadly, was witnessing Eleanor burning evidence in the vestry. His late wife's heart medication. Eleanor, fearing exposure, poisoned Canon Pennyfather's old sherry decanter, knowing Geoffrey's nervous habits would lead him there. She produced the Broken Street Michael medallion. This confirmed Eleanor's presence in the vestry that evening. The chain broke as she hurried to complete her grim work. Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. Everything I did was for Michael's sake. Thorpe was systematic in his destruction. He'd contacted the bishop, influential parishioners, even written to church publications. He wanted to demonstrate his power by utterly ruining my brother's reputation and ministry. Reverend Ashford's voice cracked with anguish. Eleanor, the scandal you sought to prevent was nothing compared to this. Whispered rumors could have been weathered. Murder cannot be undone. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, softly, then stilled. What troubles me most, my dear, is how completely you convinced yourself that murder was an act of love. The human capacity for self-deception in service of those we cherish is perhaps our most dangerous emotional failing. Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony before them. A sister's fierce love, expressed through calculated violence, had destroyed the very thing she sought to protect. The vicarage would never recover from this shadow, and Michael Ashford's ministry would forever bear the stain of Eleanor's desperate choices. The afternoon light streaming through the drawing-room windows seemed to mock the darkness that had been revealed, a reminder that evil often flourished in the most unlikely gardens, nurtured by the very virtues society held most dear: love, loyalty, and the desperate desire to protect those we cannot bear to lose. The bunting came down from Street, Mary Mead's village green with quiet efficiency, folded away by careful hands that seemed reluctant to disturb the morning air with unnecessary noise. In the days following Arthur Price's arrest, the village had resumed its familiar rhythms, though with a subtle restraint that spoke of a community learning to move carefully around a tender bruise. The brass band from Little Wickham had packed away their instruments with unusual haste. and it would be some time before their cheerful strains would again accompany a village celebration. Miss Marple observed these changes from her customary position by the sitting-room window, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm as she watched the delicate process of communal healing begin. The truth, once revealed, had left the village grappling with uncomfortable questions about the nature of judgment and the reliability of appearances. Inspector Slack had departed with considerably less confidence than he had arrived, though he had grudgingly acknowledged Miss Marple's contribution to the case's resolution. The physical evidence pointed clearly to Miss Ellis, he had admitted, during their final interview, his professional pride clearly smarting. The photographic chemicals, the inconsistencies in her story, the suspicious timing of her arrival. "Ah, but you see, Inspector," Miss Marple had replied with gentle understanding, "evidence can be arranged to tell whatever story the arranger desires. The real truth lay in understanding not just what happened, but why someone would commit such a crime, and more importantly, how their very nature would betray them in the execution." Dr. Haydock's subsequent examination had confirmed the sophisticated nature of Price's method laboratory-grade cyanide, obtained through his professional contacts, applied with the precision of someone who understood both chemistry and timing. Yet it was the emotional evidence that had ultimately exposed him. The unconscious use of his beloved Eleanor's monogrammed pie server, the practical reef knots that marked his handiwork as surely as a signature, and the desperate attempt to destroy correspondence that might reveal his careful planning. Evelyn Ellis had emerged from her ordeal with a quiet dignity that gradually earned the village's respect, though the process was neither swift nor without awkwardness. No longer hiding behind the assumed identity of Mrs. Fleming, she tended her garden at Ivy Cottage, with movements that spoke of someone slowly reclaiming their sense of safety. The charred remains of the garden shed served as a stark reminder of how close she had come to bearing the consequences of another's crime. "I never imagined that my deception would make me the perfect scapegoat," she had confided to Miss Marple during one of their quiet conversations. "To think that Mr. Price seemed so kind when he offered to help with repairs, all the while planning to use my situation to cover his terrible deed." The village's reaction to the revelation had been as varied as human nature itself. Mrs. Gascoigne, who had proclaimed her certainty about the mysterious widow's guilt with such vehemence, now spoke in hushed tones about the shocking discovery that a respected tradesman could harbor such deadly resentment. Her pronouncements had acquired a retrospective wisdom that no one quite recalled her possessing at the time. Young Tom Pritchard, his boyish certainty about obvious solutions forever tempered by recent events, had asked Miss Marple with genuine curiosity, "How did you know Miss Ellis wasn't really guilty?" "Oh, my dear boy," she had replied with her characteristic gentle smile, "I've learned that when everyone agrees about something too quickly, it's usually worth examining more closely. The human heart is far more complex than most people imagine, and the real mysteries are rarely the ones that announce themselves with such dramatic flourishes." The psychological complexity of the crime continued to fascinate Miss Marple as she reflected on the curious mathematics of revenge that had played out in their peaceful community. Arthur Price's grief for his beloved Eleanor had transformed into something far more toxic, a resentment that fed upon itself until it consumed everything he had once held dear. His meticulous planning had demonstrated considerable cunning, yet his emotional attachment to his wife's memory had provided the very clues that exposed him. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lesson of the case. Behind the most familiar faces could lurk the most unexpected secrets, and the greatest danger often came not from mysterious strangers, but from neighbors whose grievances had festered in silence until they transformed ordinary people into instruments of extraordinary malice. The village would recover, as villages always did, but the memory would linger like sediment disturbed in still water. The annual fete, once a symbol of innocent community spirit, would forever carry the shadow of that terrible afternoon when a perfect apple pie had become an instrument of death. Trust, once given implicitly, would now be tempered with the hard-earned wisdom that evil rarely announced itself with dramatic gestures, but more often crept forward wearing the mask of respectability. Life continued its eternal patterns, children calling to one another across the green, the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle whisper of wind through ancient leaves. Yet beneath the surface, tranquility lay a deeper understanding of human nature's capacity for both great kindness and terrible darkness. The widow's pie had been perfectly innocent, but the hands that had tampered with it belonged to a man whose heart had been corrupted by grief into something altogether more sinister. As Miss Marple poured her evening tea with steady hands, she reflected that perhaps this was the most important lesson of all, that in the intricate tapestry of human nature, the brightest and darkest threads were often woven by the same hand, and only the most careful observer could discern the true pattern beneath the surface design. Outside her window, street, Mary Mead settled into peaceful evening, having looked once into the darkness and chosen, with quiet determination, to continue believing in the possibility of light